Hey, it's Mel. Hey, I'm going to get out of the frame here in just a second, but I just wanted to tee up this presentation that I'm noodling over, and it came about as a result of a conversation, a great conversation I had with a local mastermind, a social media mastermind group that I usually go to every Saturday morning. My friend Eric Stegeman raised a great point about just the idea of individual bloggers like you and I, ultimately, at some point, just that whole idea just not being scalable. At some point it has to get to a point where you and I, start looking for other networks and other strategic partners to connect with. Take a look at what I mean, and let me know your thoughts.
So I started by drawing a standard graph with an x-axis and a y-axis. On the x-axis, that's a horizontal one. Let's say we'll tick off the growing number of connections with people in our various networks. So that's for connections, right? Then on the y-axis, that's the vertical one. Let's have a ruler against which we can count the total benefit or corresponding cost of the connections at each point. Then what we do is we say that with any number of connections that we have in our various social networks, there's going to be some baseline cost. And that cost is usually our time. And whether we say it's a minimum of, say, an hour or 5 hours, doesn't matter. It still represents a minimum cost, just by virtue of the fact that we're saying that we're bound to put in some minimum amount of effort, right? So that's the fixed cost associated with that. But now on top of that baseline cost, at each point, there's going to be another layer of cost that's added on to the baseline. The idea is the more connections we make, the more costs, incremental costs there are going to be. So basically the 200th connection has a greater incremental cost than the 100th connection, and the 1000th connection has a greater incremental cost than the 200th connection, such that those incremental costs, when you add them up, they get added to the baseline fixed cost at each point along that cost line. That is, the more connections you make, yeah, there's a baseline cost, but also a larger incremental cost on top of it relative to the number of connections that you had, say, yesterday and the day before. Okay, so over time, it just keeps adding on to your fixed costs. So you can call them costs of maintaining some kind of relationship with folks, even if it's somehow monitoring those connections. Okay, now hang with me here, because I do realize that filtering technologies, tweet decks, search engines, alerts, and so forth can help a lot. But that's really going to go to one of the points I'm going to make downstream. And that is, you have to implement some kind of load sharing at some point, because this model of going it alone just cannot continue scaling indefinitely. In fact, at some point you will have to implement those filtering technologies and automated alerts, but even that is only going to get you so far until you have to change the model yet again. So really, our total burden now looks like this across our continually growing number of connections over time. Now, let's overlay on top of that some theoretical plot of the benefits that you might hope to get for each point along all those connections that you're growing. So there's got to be some kind of benefit, right? Otherwise, why do it all? Even if you say you're doing it all for intrinsic value, my point is that it's still value nonetheless. Okay, so if you could theoretically plot it all out, it would look like this. It starts at the little corner on the left, because that's the point of zero benefit, implying where you have zero connections, right? That makes sense. And then it slants upwards and to the right, because theoretically speaking, the first connection has some incremental benefit, but maybe not as much by itself as when you have you made 1,000 total connections and so on. Then, as you see, both lines, they cross each other at some point. And this point has some theoretical number of connections. Now, it's not absolute, right? There's not an absolute number there, because depending on how each of us quantifies benefit, cost, and the number of connections, that point that I've labeled X1 will be different for everybody. So we're going to keep it theoretical here. And theoretically speaking, there's going to be a break-even point somewhere, such that anything to the left of that point will represent greater cost for the effort that we're putting in. And you felt that. Think about the first time you started blogging, or the first time when you only had 10 Twitter followers, or just your mom and your brother following you on Facebook as friends. It seemed like we were just writing or tweeting for ourselves, right? So that's represented by this area where each point along the red line, which is total cost, is higher up on the y-axis on that benefit curve or that cost curve than any point along the green line, which represents total benefit. So that's why conventional wisdom has said that the remedy for that, if you're going to continue engaging in these activities and not exit the space, is to increase your number of connections. That's conventional wisdom that we keep hearing. Just increase your number of followers, increase your networks, and so on, right? get your eyeballs, increase the number of eyeballs that you're getting. So the idea here is that so as you continue increasing your number of connections, at some point, so goes the conventional wisdom, after you've made enough connections, it starts getting a little bit more real, a little bit more beneficial, that is. At some point, there's an area to the right of the break-even point where benefit, plotted along the green line, becomes greater than the effort that we're putting in, which is plotted along the red line. That's when it starts feeling good. It makes us want to keep blogging and keep tweeting, or whatever floats your boat. The point is, it feels like you're getting some return, and so you keep doing it. And that's, again, sort of the conventional wisdom, right? And here's where I think my friend Eric has it right. This conventional wisdom doesn't really scale. That is, I see what this picture is trying to say theoretically, but the reality is it may be, the reality is like, it feels more like, after enough people start swimming in that pool, so to speak, it really starts feeling a bit like too much work again at some point. So what I'm saying is, I feel like there's a change that we have to make to this picture so it becomes a little bit closer to what reality feels like. And what I think that change is, or at least one of them, because you might have some other thoughts too, and I'd love to hear them, is that in reality, although the total benefit that we each get from an increased number of connections does in fact continue to grow, the reality seems to feel like cost also continues to grow, but much more quickly. Such that at some point, when the pool gets crowded enough, as it's starting to feel like these days, with all the new bloggers and the new social media consultants that spring up every single day, right? The cost of wading through all of that noise to continue getting our message out just seems to grow much more quickly than the benefits that we continue to earn. So at some point, the cost crosses the benefit line again and hits another break-even point. And that happens at another theoretical number of connections that's bigger than the number we had before when it was just starting to feel good. I mean, when we started off, it didn't feel like we were getting a whole lot out of it because we didn't have enough connections. Then when we did, it started feeling great, so our objective became to get more followers, right? That's the space area here. But then if you continued following that path, and at some point it starts to feel sort of bad again. I mean, not really bad, but in this area, you're still getting a lot of benefit out of it. Benefit continues to grow, but it really just feels like work now. And again, some of you might be feeling this now with your, if you have 1,000 followers on Twitter, you have 1,000, several thousand blog readers or whatever. When you get to that point, you're starting to it starts feeling like you got to keep pumping out original and compelling content every week. I mean, you keep doing it anyway because you're still getting increasing benefit. It still feels good, as evidenced by that green line. It continues slanting upwards. But the fact is, you're just one person, and you won't be able to keep scaling this way forever because even though that benefit line keeps going up, so does the cost much more quickly because of just the numbers of connections that you're trying to cater to now. And that's the increasing burden of going it alone. And at this point, something's got to give. So what can you do about it? Well, clearly, you can decrease the number of connections. That's one valid remedy, because if you place your finger near where the X2 point is, where we have labeled X2 on the X-axis there, and then trace it back towards the left while holding, say, a pencil vertically up to the top of the page, then you see it starts pulling you back into that green zone. So clearly, that's one thing you can do. You can decrease the number of people that you're connected with, and some of us do that. But the other thing you can do, too, is to reduce the cost burden. That is, load share, or share some of the burden of creating content every now and then with other people or with other networks, create strategic partnerships. Now, I won't go into the math of it, but as it turns out, this line, the line representing cost, has something called a slope to it. If you can reduce that slope, represented by the cost burden, then what that actually does is it has the effect of pushing that cost line out a little more in the shallow direction, like I'm showing here with that dotted orange line. Some of you that remember your college algebra course will remember the slope curve, right? In any case, the net effect is that you actually increase your capacity to continue gaining benefits by pushing the new break-even point further up the curve. See that? So theoretically speaking, you get yourself more time in the green zone of benefit if you can reduce the cost burden by sharing the load with others and create strategic partnerships to create content, syndicate some of your content publishing activities. And that's what I'm showing here with this new where these new crossover points are after you successfully tip that cost curve over a bit more by being strategic about how you create content. So during that meeting anyway that I was telling you about last Saturday, we talked about what some strategies might be for reducing those cost burdens. And I'll share some more of those with you in the next post. But in the meantime, let me know what you think. If this makes sense to you and you believe that at some point, if you keep growing your network and keep producing magnetic content, right, what are some tips and strategies would you suggest in order to reduce the cost burden for yourself so you can continue scaling? All right, this is Mel with meleclara.com. I'll wait to hear your thoughts and touch base with you again next time. Take care.